I've been a cardiac surgeon at Riverside Medical Center in Charleston, West Virginia, for 18 years. Or at least I was, until I submitted my resignation last month. In that time, I've performed over 3,000 heart surgeries, witnessed countless medical miracles, and saved lives that seem beyond saving. But there's this one case that changed everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the very nature of human existence. It was a cold February evening in 2023. I was finishing rounds when my pager buzzed at 11:47 p.m. A message from Dr. Sarah Chen, the emergency department attending, was brief. Code blue, cardiac arrest, incoming trauma. ETA 12 minutes. Need you in OR 3 immediately. And by the time I reached the cardiac surgical suite, my team was already prepared. James Rivera, my surgical tech of more than 10 years, was ready. Dr. Patricia Williams, one of the most experienced anesthesiologists in the state, was monitoring vitals. Whatever was coming, I knew we could handle it. The paramedics wheeled in Anthony Yale, a 37-year-old construction supervisor from Ohio. His wife Linda had found him in their bedroom hours earlier, unresponsive and barely breathing. They had managed to restore a faint pulse, but his condition was critical. Skin gray, heart rhythm chaotic, blood pressure barely measurable. To be honest, Anthony was on the edge of life and death. Well, we worked for hours. His heart would stabilize briefly, then collapse again. We tried medications, shocks, emergency interventions. Nothing lasted. Every minute that ticked by made the situation bleaker. By 4:17 a.m., Anthony Yale was gone. Flatline on the monitor, no pulse, no brain activity, early rigor mortis beginning. I stepped out to deliver the news to his wife and teenage son. The grief in the waiting room was unbearable, Linda cradling her son, sobbing. I signed his death certificate. We had followed every protocol. Anthony was dead. And then, 75 minutes later, everything I knew about life and death unraveled. James burst into my office, pale and frantic. "Doctor, Patterson, you need to see this. The monitors. They're showing a heartbeat." I followed him, certain it was a malfunction. But when I entered OR 3, I froze. There he was. Anthony Yale, sitting up on the surgical table, fully conscious, looking around with alert and clear eyes. I couldn't speak. Every definition of death I had ever learned had been shattered. I checked his vitals myself. Heart rate is steady. Blood pressure is normal. The brain functions perfectly. He had been dead. And now, he was alive. Anthony remembered floating above the room, seeing us work on him, hearing his wife's voice urging him to return. He had been given a choice, and he had come back. Over the following months, similar cases unfolded. Walter Williams, a 78-year-old hospice patient, had started breathing again during embalming preparation. Velma Thomas, 59, awoke 17 hours after being declared dead, speaking with her son and seeing her late husband. Each recovery was complete, flawless, and utterly inexplicable. I realized I could no longer make life and death decisions with certainty. How many patients had we declared dead too soon? How many might have returned if we had waited? The protocols I had trusted for decades suddenly felt inadequate. In March 2024, I resigned from Riverside and moved to a small town in Montana, trading the operating room for family medicine. I treat chronic conditions, minor ailments, anything that doesn't force me to decide who lives or dies. But Anthony, Walter, and Velma haunt me still. They were all declared dead by proper medical standards, yet all returned fully alive, with no neurological damage. I can't dismiss what I witnessed. The dead don't always stay dead. Sometimes the impossible comes back, clear-eyed and alive, leaving those of us left behind to question what we really understand about life and what lies beyond it. If you ever find yourself standing at the edge of life and death, remember what we define as dead isn't always final. Some hearts stop and then start again, in ways medicine can't explain. Before you take your next breath for granted, like, comment, and share this, and subscribe before the clock strikes the impossible hour. Because once the line between life and death blurs, it might never be the same again. For 22 years, I worked as a neurologist at Columbia Park Ridge Medical Center in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I consulted on countless cases: strokes, tumors, traumatic injuries, persistent vegetative states. I thought I understood the boundaries of neurological recovery, but nothing could have prepared me for Officer Gary Dockery, a case that completely shattered my certainties about consciousness. It was September 17th, 1988, in Walden, Tennessee. Gary, a 35-year-old police officer, responded to a routine domestic disturbance call. I later learned it was a trap. Samuel Downey, harboring grudges from previous reprimands, shot Gary point blank in the forehead. The bullet fragmented, destroying much of his left frontal lobe, the region critical for personality, speech, and decision-making. He was rushed to Erlanger Hospital in Chattanooga. I reviewed the neurosurgeon's notes. It was a doctor, Robert Martinez. He mentioned that Gary had faced catastrophic damage: swelling, bleeding, and irreparable tissue loss. After an 8-hour surgery, 20% of Gary's frontal lobe had been removed. The bullet fragments remained. Gary survived, but barely. Weeks passed. Swelling persisted. He remained unconscious, and the prognosis was grim. A month later, he was diagnosed with a persistent vegetative state. He displayed sleep-wake cycles, occasional grimaces, and reflexive movements. His family clung to hope, pointing to blinks and hand squeezes as signs of awareness. I didn't see it that way. From everything I knew, those behaviors were involuntary. I first took charge of Gary's case in 1992 when I became head of neurology at Columbia Park Ridge. I studied his scans, visited him at Signal Mountain Nursing Home, and saw the classic PVS, no meaningful, reliable responses. Gary remained in this state for nearly 8 years. Then, in February 1996, everything changed. Gary developed pneumonia, and his condition deteriorated. I was summoned to the ICU in the early hours by a nurse who could barely contain her astonishment. "Dr. Kaplan, Gary Dockery is awake and talking." I could hardly believe it. There he was, after 7.5 years, sitting up, fully alert, conversing with his sister. His eyes tracked movement, and he recognized me immediately. He had no memory of his police service or the shooting, but he recalled his life prior to 1988 with complete clarity. His personality, his reasoning, his voice, all intact. Over the next 18 hours, he spoke at length with family and staff. He asked about the world, events, presidents, and his sons. I performed neurological exams. Everything confirmed it: clarity, cognition, full awareness. Brain imaging showed no new healing, no physical explanation. EEG readings, previously consistent with vegetative state, now displayed normal waking activity. But as the hours passed, his speech began to fade. After a scheduled lung surgery, his consciousness diminished further. He gradually returned to simple phrases and minimal interaction, ultimately reverting to his previous state. His brief awakening was never replicated, despite every attempt to reproduce the conditions or medications that might have triggered it. Gary Dockery died just over a year later, on April 15, 1997, from a pulmonary embolism, a tragically common outcome for long-term immobilized patients. The medical community was captivated. Specialists from across the country studied his case. Theories abounded: fever and antibiotics, triggering dormant neural pathways, the brink of death provoking awakening. But none could fully explain the completeness, clarity, and brevity of his recovery. What struck me most wasn't the temporary recovery itself. It was the possibility that consciousness had persisted undetected for years. If Gary could awaken, recognize people, recall facts, and express awareness immediately, how much had he truly been aware all along? I could no longer dismiss the observations of his family. His case shook me to my core. How many other patients labeled vegetative might harbor hidden awareness? I began examining patients more closely, listening to families more carefully, and following consciousness research with renewed urgency. Eventually, I resigned from neurology, unable to continue practicing with the same certainty I once had. Gary Dockery's 18 hours of consciousness defied medical logic. They forced me and countless others to confront the limits of our understanding. More than a rare anomaly, his experience was like a challenge to treat brain-injured patients with compassion and openness. The line between conscious and unconscious, I realized, may be far more permeable and mysterious than we imagine. The most important lesson is profoundly human. Those we label as vegetative may be far more present than anyone realizes. Gary's awakening was a fleeting, precious moment proof that the mysteries of the brain far exceed our current explanations. Before starting my career as a physician, working in prison medicine seemed unlikely. But with mounting student debt and limited job options, I accepted a position at Millfield Correctional Facility, outside Phoenix, a medium-security prison housing over 3,000 men. Then the reality hit me immediately. Concrete walls, razor wire, and the weight of broken lives. My supervisor, Dr. Stokes, was firm. In prison, trust nothing without verification and always prioritize safety. Inmates lied, manipulated, and sometimes expressed genuine gratitude. Guards range from compassionate professionals to those hardened by cynicism. Veteran officer Silas Romero taught me the key: treat inmates as people, not just criminals. My first weeks were spent treating chronic illnesses and injuries, settling into the rhythm of correctional healthcare. After a month, I was scheduled for my first night shift, a quieter environment. But, as Dr. Stokes warned, one where the atmosphere could turn philosophical. That night, the medical unit received an emergency call from DB Block, an inmate exhibiting erratic behavior, possibly a seizure. The patient, Matteo Lucero, had been in solitary after attacking a cellmate. I found him in a trance-like state, terrified, claiming to see children he had killed. Despite my initial suspicion of drugs or psychiatric breakdown, Matteo's story chilled me. He described a fatal accident from 12 years earlier, a drunk hit and run outside Tempe, Arizona, killing 4 children and injuring 6, details matching an infamous unsolved case. Matteo confessed he had fled, changed license plates, and sold the car to evade blame. Physically, Matteo was wasting away. Rapid pulse, weight loss, abdominal pain. A CT scan confirmed late-stage pancreatic cancer. He said the children were coming to collect, and only confession could bring peace. In lucid moments, he insisted I contact the families and report what he had done. As a doctor, I faced an ethical dilemma, balancing patient confidentiality, legal duty, and the moral need to help grieving families. After consulting the prison's legal department, I contacted Phoenix Police. Detective Marquez was skeptical at first, but after hearing the precise details Matteo provided, the investigation moved forward. DNA evidence confirmed his confession. He had been the driver responsible for the deaths. A decade-old case finally closed. Matteo died a few days later from internal bleeding. His last words, spoken to Nurse Helena, were an apology to one of his victims. At his modest funeral, I received a letter from Leah Escudero's mother, thanking me for helping bring some measure of closure. Now, we know that he carried the weight of what he did, and that he was sorry. It doesn't bring Leah back, but it helps us understand that she wasn't just forgotten. Matteo's case changed how I viewed medicine. I began to see that guilt, stress, and unresolved trauma could manifest as real physical and psychological symptoms. Over the following months, I encountered other inmates experiencing similar hallucinations and guilt, visions of victims, requests for redemption, driven more by conscience than pure psychosis. Psychiatrists suggested these were coping mechanisms: the prison environment, isolation, and guilt. But the specificity of Mateo's confession, his clear remorse, and his physical decline made me question the limits of medical explanation. Could guilt manifest as illness? Could facing the truth bring healing, or at least peace? After 2 years, I moved on to civilian medicine, yet the memory of those nights at Millfield, especially Mateo's final confession, stayed with me. Healing often requires more than treating bodies, because it sometimes means helping people confront their darkest truths, providing comfort or closure they didn't know they needed. Mateo's confession didn't undo his crime, but it allowed his victims' families to know their children weren't forgotten. Their suffering had been heard. For me, practicing medicine became less about fixing what's physically broken and more about helping people make peace with their past. The children Mateo killed, Leia, Camila, Benio, and Anmi, were remembered not just by their families, but by the man responsible. In the end, his truth offered a measure of justice, closure, and the knowledge that guilt, for all its pain, can also be a path to peace. Sometimes bearing witness is the greatest intervention we can offer.